this time we're going to have our Q&A. So all of the presenters from this morning, Chris, Jamie, Gwen, Keith, and Matthew, if you could please come up to this table here. We have a microphone on your left, over there. So don't feel shy about asking questions. Please come up to the microphone, ask your questions, or you can just say congratulations too if you'd like. We have about a half hour before we take our lunch break, so hope you all have some questions. Come on up. Make sure it's working. Okay, good. So Matthew, my first question will be for you. It was a pretty awesome mount, by the way. Very cool. Installation, how did it go? And did everything fit together nicely? And was it quick?
It went together pretty quickly. Everything fit pretty well, which was kind of surprising, especially since the arms were a little bit, they had to spring up a little bit in order to add the support needed to keep the arches stable. And sometimes that spring can kind of change the length of where each of the bumps correspond with the arm. And luckily, I got lucky and it all fit pretty well. So
There's some good documentation,
too. It was a surprise.
Come on up.
Hi, Matthew, this is actually for you as well. Number one, how long did it take start to finish making that mount, if you don't mind my asking?
It was kind of a 3-month process of
3 months?
back and forth with the conservator.
Okay.
I would do a little bit, and she'd have to take the mount away to work on the crown, work on the arches, bending them back. Basically, the arches had to be bent back in shape before I could create the mount. So that took a while. And at that point, the top arches were off, so I actually started working with the bottom half at that point. But I'd say start to finish a few months.
And what type of brass?
Of course, I was working on other things during that time. But
right.
Yeah.
What type of brass were you using too for that?
We used to use 360, but I've moved away from 360 just for the health reasons, because it contains lead. I try to get 260 because it has little to no lead content, and it's not as easy to find in certain stocks. So some of it's 360, but most of it was 260.
Awesome, thanks.
Well, I'm going to ask another question then. This is a question sort of for Chris and Jamie, for both of you, and that there was that case of shipwreck objects, and you talked about making it breathable. And Chris, I know that we sometimes have cases that are breathable here, and sometimes cases we really try to seal up. And I wondered if either of you could speak to methods to controlling air exchanges in cases, or how you go about doing that work.
You want to go first? Sure. I mean, it's a hard one necessarily to talk to. For one thing, the last guy was a mount maker and not a designer of the casework. They had realized there was a need for a certain amount of air exchange, and so just as a matter of course built the cases so that they did not have an absolute seal to them, and were hoping was talking with one of the designers, and they were talking in the area of 15 or so air exchanges a day. It was all possible because the building is a new building and had a good HVAC system that could then help maintain the other needed factors of temperature and humidity. When I was in Santa Fe, it was a much more difficult thing because there we had some buildings that had virtually no HVAC system for humidification, and we'd be at 17%. And so, it's one of those things that is a real balancing act of how do you enclose things to maintain those pieces of the environment versus letting them breathe enough to try to help with off-gassing issues. And in looking at that, it's definitely a decision of where's the greater danger coming from. And in that situation, especially with things that were coming in on loan, the danger of low humidity was a far more present danger than the danger of corrosion. And so there we sealed up cases and put gel in them to try to maintain humidity.
And Chris, before you take over, I just have a note for everyone speaking. We are recording this on video, and it will be on our website, but I need you to pull the microphones closer because otherwise it doesn't get picked up on the video. Thank you.
Right, so you're balancing between the need to maintain a stable relative humidity inside the showcase and the need to make sure there aren't pollutants inside your showcase. Even if you do have a contemporary HVAC system and you generally have high standards for relative humidity in your gallery space, your system's definitely going to fail someday. So if you're okay with the objects inside the showcase being subjected to fluctuations in relative humidity like that, that's one thing. But if you're not, then it's important to have a tight seal and to use lots of scavenger inside the case and change it frequently.
Hi, my name is Samantha Springer. I'm a conservator, and I used to work here at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I have a question and kind of just a statement more. I'm one of the main contributors for the AIC wiki pages for the materials databases, so thank you for the plug. And so one of my questions was that those pages are constantly under construction, and so we are always looking for contributions and suggestions. So if you use those pages and use the information on there, if you have any suggestions for how we can make those pages better, if you have one idea I came up with after Jamie's talk was that maybe we need a section where you can list materials that you would like to be tested. We know from Chris's talk that testing the materials is not an easy task and it takes a lot of time. So I don't know if there's anyone out there who will volunteer to test them, but then at least we know of other materials that people are using or interested in using that we would like to make sure that they're still safe for using inside cases or with other art materials. So if you're interested, have suggestions, have questions, please come find me. So sorry, that wasn't really a question for you guys, but just for the general forum. Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha.
Also, a showcase like that that's having pollutant issues would be a great application for AD test strips, so you could see one aspect of how bad the environment is inside the case.
So I actually have a question for Keith.
Little thing.
I was fascinated by your use of the titanium rod. I've used stainless rod for increased stiffness, but wanted to hear about your sourcing and how you felt the comparison was.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. I had two sources for titanium to begin with. One was called President's Titanium, which didn't want to give me any titanium if I wasn't building an airplane or something. They wanted a lot of titanium in their order, and they keep sending me these calendars with jets on it and stuff. The second group is called ThyssenKrupp, which is, I think they're kind of an internet distributor, because you ask them to get metal, and no matter where that metal is, no matter what it is, they send it to you. Could be a 25-foot extruded piece of aluminum square rod. And they're pretty good. They're pretty fast. So those are the two groups, ThyssenKrupp and President's Titanium. I always want to use a more rigid material than brass. Brass is, especially once it's been annealed or anything, it just seems to not hold up as well. And I know stainless is a preferred, but I started using titanium because I found that I could get 1/16 of an inch titanium, and it was pretty rigid, and especially when it's in a vertical position. I was able to make it was almost a 2-foot mount, about a 30-inch mount for a small razor, and I used a magnet to hold the razor at the top. And so the magnets were used. And it was pretty rewarding. And since then, I've used this very small stock of titanium that I have. But did that?
Yeah, I'll try it.
All right, great.
Hi, good transition to magnets. Your talk was really interesting. Thank you. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with the limitations of magnets. I know they're often used for textiles and paper, but have you found, sort of exemplary uses for larger objects, more sculptural objects, and any advice with taking them apart, like safely, without damaging objects? Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think one of the parts of discussing about what a magnetic system is because this is really in its infancy. I think that as we go along, more of these questions will be answered. I think that part of the difficulty in discussing these sorts of things is that we have not recorded accurately or fully what the systems are that we're using. So often, a lot of people, use magnets, but when you sort of delve down deeper of what they've actually used, there's not a way of reproducing that system because the steel gauge hasn't been recorded or the grade and size of the magnet. And because of that, then we can't keep track, just like the Adtesting or any of these sorts of things. So that's part of what I'm trying to get people to start doing is actually recording, and so that then when there is a success, then it's something that we can continue on or build from that kind of information. The other thing is that, which I didn't really go into, is the location of where you place the magnet versus the steel or any of the components. And I think in a lot of cases there are places where if the system can be behind the artifact, then you, in essence, don't have to worry about crushing or compression of the artifact itself. Now, oftentimes, those sorts of things require stitching or some sort of adhesive or something like that to get some component of it behind. But that is a successful method of doing it. The other is these large area sort of pressure kinds of things, of distributing the pressure over across of a larger area than just in one location. But the idea of like how many magnets to use for any individual artifact, whether based on its size or its thickness, its actual mass, all of those sorts of things, we've really not talked about that yet to even give a sense. the way people use magnets right now is really an intuitive, like, oh, I feel better having another magnet there, more than any other real understanding of what is going on. That's part of why I want to hear how people use them and sort of gather up systems and try to get all that information together, so that we can start sort of accumulating how people are using them, whether it's on leather hides, or large photographs, or all sorts of things. So this is really the beginning, and sort of like you all are kind of a wonderful audience to talk to about this particular subject. So, did I answer your question?
Tiny follow-up.
Okay, sure.
Tiny follow-up to that, which maybe I've never thought about this before. How do earthquakes and magnets, is there any science on that?
Well, I do know that some people in Taiwan are using electromagnets for earthquakes. But I think, again, that's like sort of a more of an area. Though the one thing about like the neodymium, as long as you're not crashing it too much, but it's going to maintain its magnetic force. So in a kind of a shaking kind of situation, I would think it would be a stable kind of mount. But welcome, enjoy, maybe you should look into that.
Hi, Conservator Heather Galloway. Gwen, I have another question for you. So since you're at this forefront of collecting research on magnets, I'm wondering if you have given any thought to a template that people could use to get the information that you need to push research forward, and what forum you would distribute that template so these people can help you.
Right, so actually on my website, I have where you can download a Word document, which actually is sort of a table where all these questions get answered, so that we can start. So there's a place to download that. Also, Dante, sent him a packet of things that will be made available for people, and in that packet is also information, the same document that you can fill out, and then you can just email me. So yeah, I'm open to a lot, any kind of suggestion on how to do that. So I'm open for more discussion.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I've got a few questions, if I allowed, while I'm up here. Just sort of tying together Gwen and Matthew's comments. Gwen on documentation, and Matthew, in the initial stages of your talk, you mentioned something of a reluctance to have to provide too much documentation that might have to be required of a complex mount. And I think your efforts towards simplicity are applaudable, and it's a wonderful looking mount. But I did want to pick up on the issue of documentation, and particularly tied to conservation. I'm glad to see we have so many conservators here. Every treatment that I'm aware of done in my department, there's a dedicated treatment report done. It goes in file. The next person to work on that piece can go reference that file. And I'm wondering what documentation you did besides the presentation, if any, on the mount for that crown, because it is such a wonderful mount, and simple as it is. There are some features that I can imagine somebody approaching that mount 10 years from now or 20 years from now, if you're no longer around, having a few questions about. And I think it is a crucial thing to create documentation similar to treatment reports. And I'd like to hear if you did anything on that or what your thoughts are.
I haven't documented it yet other than the presentation. And our museum is starting to implement more documentation on these more complicated mounts. But it's kind of in its infancy right now. But we're planning on having a much more, a database for all of these things. But yeah, it would be very important to do that. So it's something we'll be doing in the future.
Probably most people working in museums or institutions similar use a TMS type system, which we have at the Getty, and it's only recently that they've reformatted TMS to be able to accept our mount notes. We have over 1,000 Word documents and the files we use documenting the mounts we've made over the years, and they're generally available to our department, but not the entire museum. And it's only recently that we've been able to download PDFs of those into the conservation notes in TMS. Finding the time to do that is a whole other issue that we're still trying to address, but that's out there as a possibility as well. I highly recommend it. I mean, if objects go on loan, you can send the mount notes ahead to the borrower and get a good idea of what's required to support that mount. And it is a wonderful mount, by the way. And just Jamie?
I was just going to say that I'm in being in private practice, not having a system. I'm in the process of trying to put together a set of templates in FileMaker Pro specifically for documentation. And one of the things that I like about that is that there's an ability to bring in a short video. Because to me, one of the easiest ways to document how a mount goes together is to set up a camera on a tripod and install the mount and narrate it as I'm going. Because you can say, right now I'm shading this a little back and putting it in this way. And so, again, the time factor of getting the templates made is eluded me, but it's part of kind of where I'm trying to go with this, but it's specifically the ability to do a short video clip really feels like a good way to document.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Gwen, you mentioned there were certain magnets that were more prone to being susceptible to shock, and maybe that relates back to the question on magnets and earthquakes. Can you elaborate a little more on which magnets are better able to resist shock?
So, well, the neodymium is the one that is most susceptible to shock. Just as a side note, and it came home to me, was my son does Odyssey of the Mind, and last year's performance, one of the characters had a hat and a card stuck to the hat because a little dynamium magnet was in the play card, and part of the skit was her throwing it down on the ground. And by the time they got to the actual performance, it no longer stuck to her hat. So that, how often do they have a dress rehearsal, et cetera? So it happens pretty quickly. And clearly, there's that in-between when it's dropped a couple of times or you've snapped it by accident together a few times. It still has a holding power, but it's no longer the same holding power as when you first bought it. So that's why the care and handling of especially the neodymium are really critical. So it's really the one that's like that outside of the other 4 permanent magnets. In the sense of documentation, what I've really tried to do, but not been successful at all, is sort of creating a way of writing out your system, you know, when we use an adhesive, we always write it, you know, weight per volume, percent with the solvent, et cetera. Is if there could be a similar kind of way of doing that. But in some respects, maybe it's too complicated because where do you put the magnet? Is in the front, is in the back, is, you know, all these sort of variables. But it seems that some way of recording everything in some system outside of some worksheet perhaps could be possible. You know, I don't know. I've attempted, I wrote an article at the Western Association of Art Conservation newsletter a number of years ago, and there was my sort of attempt of doing something along those lines. But, so, again, anybody has ideas, let me know.
Electromagnets were brought up. Do you plan on incorporating any of that in your publication?
You know, this project, as I started off my talk, it only expands on, and at some point, the publication is going to have to get done. Like, I maybe be interested, there was, someone's going to be presenting at AIC regarding sort of maybe a possible negative side of magnets that they used in their institution where, I don't know enough about it, but that they claim that the magnet used collected dust from the air. And it could be that it's very site-specific. In my small amount of reading about aerosols and magnetic dust, that is the case, but it made me think that in institutions that are in high urban populations, possibly there is such a thing as a air filter that has a magnet component. I don't know if there is such a thing, but that would be interesting. It seems to me if your magnet is drawing magnetic dust, you have a bigger issue. And I would be really concerned about the health of the security guards over the discoloration of the artwork. But as I said, it just keeps expanding. One of the parts where I do want to include is when not to use magnets, which for like audio tape or even perhaps modern art now that uses different kind of components like that that would be severely affected by the use of magnets in proximity.
We have time for one more question.
I'm Mark Erdman, art conservator here in Cleveland. Chris, I wanted to ask you about the corrosion intercept foam that you mentioned in the little fan housing. I know you mentioned that it has metal fibers or particles, and how, what kind of range of pollutants does that actually filter out, if that's how it works, and under what, does it only work with metal objects protecting against corrosion? Does it filter out sulfur, or how does that work?
I'll have to get back to you on that. I know it's used by jewelers.
Okay, so it's, but it is metal particles in there that are, in a sense, sacrificially corroding in place
Correct.
of the object that it's protecting?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, let's get another round of applause for our presenters this morning. Thank you all.